I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the evolution of the San Diego Union-Tribune. And I think it's important to do that because the evolution of this newspaper really reflects the evolution of this region over the last century and a half. And after we sort of go through the development of this newspaper, we'll sort of take a little tour of the inner sanctum of the editorial board. We'll see how sausage is made, and we'll address a little bit the whole marketplace of ideas that I like to term the editorial page. I think you should know that the San Diego Union-Tribune is the oldest business in San Diego County. No other business has survived over the last 136 years. The paper, the Union, of course, was the first, and it was founded on October the 10th, 1868, after the Civil War. There were two men from the Gold Rush country, from Calaveras County, Jeff Gatewood and Edward Bushyhead. Bushyhead was a Cherokee Indian. His family all bore the name because of a certain characteristic, genetic trait of the family. Jeff Gatewood was a lawyer. He had killed a man in a duel up in the gold country. They came from San Andreas. The gold had run out, and they were looking for a place to start another newspaper. So they came to San Diego with their Washington hand press, and they set up shop in a cottage in Old Town. It's now a museum. It was a dusty little town, little street in Old Town. The city at the time was less than 2,000 people. The whole county, which actually stretched all the way to the Colorado River, it included what is now Imperial County. The whole county was only about 3,000 people. And Jeff Gatewood took the leading role in getting the paper started. Bushyhead refused even to have his name put on the masthead at the time because he didn't think the enterprise would survive. But both men had strong Union sympathies. The Civil War had just ended 3 years earlier, and so they named their newspaper to show their Union sympathies. And Gatewood wrote in the very first edition something that I think really stands through the last 136 years as well, I hate to say the mission statement because that's such a tired term, but the aim of the Union-Tribune, the Union and the Tribune. But this is what he wrote in the first edition of the paper. He promised a paper that would reflect from its pages times of distress as well as prosperity, hopes and fears, gloom and gaiety, smiles and tears. It must toil, he said, in the grand struggle for the improvement of Southern California, in opening the way for the march of civilization, in leveling the hills, grading the streets, developing the mines, tilling the soil, planting vineyards and fruit trees, in building wharves, docks, arsenals, and fortifications. He went on to say, my dream is that the waters of our bay will someday fret beneath the burden of busy commerce, hear the shrill whistle of the iron horse as it spurns the sand of the desert, to see our bay surrounded by mammoth manufacturing and schools of learning, the streets teeming with a prosperous and industrial people. It's a pretty good vision for San Diego if you think about what was here in 1868. It's a vision that Gatewood followed throughout his life. He stayed in San Diego for many decades and was involved in civic affairs. However, I must say he left the paper after a couple of years because it wasn't making the kind of money that he could make as a criminal lawyer in San Diego, where there apparently was a lot of business. But I think one of the things that makes this paper stand out over the centuries is it has always been a paper that had a vision for the community. It's much more than a commercial enterprise, as virtually every newspaper is. So the Union at the time, when it was beginning to get off the ground in Old Town, sold for $5 a year or 50 cents a month. It was a weekly until 1871, printed on a hand press that printed 4 pages at a time. 1871, it went to daily publication. In 1890, John D. Spreckels arrived on the scene from San Francisco. Spreckels was, of course, a sugar magnate. He'd made money on sugar plantations in Hawaii and on shipping. And he and his brother came to San Diego and bought the Union. A few years later, they bought the Evening-Tribune, which was actually started in 1895. John D. Spreckels bought it in 1901. So if we fast forward then into the early 20th century, Spreckels, of course, was involved in many of the great enterprises of San Diego, developing water, a reliable source of water. The wooden flume that stretched to Lake Cuyamaca was a great project of John D. Spreckels and the Union. Of course, the development of streetcars and the railway to the east, which we still talk about today, the need for a better rail link to the east. But John D. Spreckels actually dug those tunnels and built the railway that for some time did carry freight directly to the east. If we fast forward then to 1927, along comes Colonel Ira Copley, who bought the paper from John D. Spreckels' heirs. Colonel Copley, Ira Copley, not only bought the Union and the Tribune, he also bought the John D. Spreckels mansion in Coronado and moved in with his family. He became the new John D. Spreckels of San Diego. Ira Copley was a rather interesting figure. He had he was a utility magnate in northern Illinois at a time when utilities were all private, and they competed against each other in those days to sell primarily gas, to provide a gas line to your house, and then to sell you gas appliances in the days of gas lights and new gas stoves were coming online. And he made a lot of money and decided he wanted to serve in Congress. And as many wealthy men did of that era, he bought a newspaper to be a platform for his political career. His first newspaper was the Aurora Beacon in northern Illinois. He was elected to Congress in 1910, and he was very much a progressive Republican, fiscally conservative, but very much attracted to Teddy Roosevelt and the progressive era that was then blooming in the United States. And in his first bid for re-election in 1912, he joined the Bull Moose Republicans. And if you'll remember, the election of 1912 was split by the Bull Moose candidacy of Teddy Roosevelt. Woodrow Wilson was elected because of the split in the Republican Party between William Howard Taft, who was the incumbent seeking re-election that year. Ira Copley came to San Diego quite a bit because he had brought his parents here to retire in Coronado in the 1890s. He loved San Diego, and when the papers were up for sale because of the death of John D. Spreckels, he moved his newspaper empire, which by that time was about 10 or 12, 14 papers in Illinois, to Southern California, and he began to acquire other papers in Southern California. Ira Copley was the publisher of the paper for about 20 years. He was very much interested in the advancement of San Diego's economy and development in general, and he promoted those ideas on his editorial page. In 1947, he died, and his adopted son, Jim Copley, whom some of you may have been around long enough to have known, became publisher. Anybody here been around long enough to have known Jim Copley? Okay. Jim Copley took over at a very young age. He was more energetic, really, than any of the previous publishers in terms of an agenda for San Diego that he saw. This was, of course, the booming post-war era. Jim Copley was very much involved in a number of issues. He had been on active duty in the Naval Reserve during World War II. He was very much a proponent of the Navy. He was a proponent of the civic development of downtown San Diego, of building a civic center and that sort of thing. And he took a very strong hand on the editorial page, as publishers in those days did. We'll move forward to 1973 when Jim Copley died. He died at a relatively young age. He was 58 of cancer. He left the newspaper empire to his widow, of course, Helen Copley. And he died on the eve of the newspaper's move from downtown to Mission Valley, where it is today. Helen Copley took over the papers. Many thought that she would either sell or bring in new management. She didn't do that. She took charge on her own. And she made a series of very tough decisions. She let a number of top executives go when they seemed to not want to cooperate with her ideas. She had to sell some of the newspapers and some of the broadcast properties to pay very onerous inheritance taxes that were then in place. But she moved the paper forward, and she took an active role as well on the editorial page in promoting a lot of issues in San Diego. She was the publisher of the paper for 28 years until 2001. She was the second longest publisher of the paper, John D. Spreckels having been the longest serving. And in 2001, she made her son, David, the publisher. And as you know, David has been publisher since 2001, and Helen died last year at the age of 82. Now, during these years, the paper, of course, crusaded for a number of issues. And they're all things that I think all of us would recognize as essential to San Diego's development over the last 136 years. One of them was an adequate water supply. The paper campaigned relentlessly for the aqueducts and the development of water from the Colorado River to make San Diego a region that was viable for growth. As I mentioned, there was the rail line to the east that Spreckels championed. Public education was an issue that occupied a lot of the editorial pages ink over the years, promoting the need for better public schools, promoting bond issues to build schools, in general urging the voters to expand the financial resources of local education. In 1904, the Union ran a series of editorials crusading on the need for a public library. San Diego at the time had no public library. Andrew Carnegie was handing out grants, as you may know, from that era to build libraries, and the city, with the Union's constant urging on the editorial page, was able to get a $50,000 grant from Andrew Carnegie to start the first downtown library. Excuse me, and those of you who read the paper today know that a new downtown library is a cause that the editorial page cares quite a bit about and continues to promote. I last year did a paper for a group called Scolia on San Diego in 1904, and I found a few interesting facts. At the time, in the election of 1904, as I said, and this was the election of Teddy Roosevelt running to get his own full term after having succeeded McKinley. San Diego County was a stalwart Republican community, and the Union on its pages, not only the editorial page, crusaded relentlessly for the election not only of Teddy Roosevelt, but also for a full Republican slate on the Board of Supervisors who were up for re-election and other offices. And an interesting footnote is, in that year, just a century ago, that presidential election, the Democratic nominee was a guy named Alton Parker, someone who's been almost lost to history. But there was a third candidate in the race also, and that was Eugene Debs, the socialist labor leader. In San Diego County, Teddy Roosevelt won convincingly, but the second place finisher was not the Democrat Alton Parker, but rather Eugene Debs. Along with all of the other causes, I think we'll sort of just move forward to the current day. Helen Copley was very much involved in promoting literacy and also in promoting a strong Navy, which was part of the legacy of her husband, and in also promoting a strong military generally. The editorial page was very strongly involved in urging the establishment of UCSD in the early 60s, in the promotion also of SDSU and USD for that matter. Helen Copley served on the board of, thank you, Herman, served on the board of USD. And we go through all of the major turning points in San Diego's history. The paper, of course, was involved in promoting its view, which was generally, and remains to this day, a moderate Republican viewpoint. We'll get to that at question time, all right? Yes, we'll put that question on top. But my point in saying all this is that all of this, the paper has always sought, especially on the editorial page, especially through its publisher and the editorial board, to have a broader mission than the day-to-day journalism that the newspaper, of course, is engaged in. And that is to adhere to a vision for San Diego, a vision for the world. I will describe that as generally a moderate Republican point of view. You can decide for yourself if you read the paper what moderate is. But let's move into sort of the current situation that I think a lot of people want to hear about and that I'm certainly often asked about. And that is, how in the world does the editorial board function? What is it all about? What happens in the inner sanctum? I'm looking at John Warren over here, who publishes his own newspaper, and he's got a little simpler situation. For his editorials, he only has to persuade his wife to go along. At our editorial board, it's a little more complicated situation. But as always, the newspaper reflects the views of the publisher. That is the case, and John is shaking his head vigorously. That is the case at every newspaper. The editorial board is there generally to carry out its views, but they need to be in sync with those of the publisher, and the publisher has the right, and in my view, the obligation to make sure that his editorial page reflects his view of the world, or her view of the world. The editorial board itself, of course, is made up of a little more than a dozen people. It includes the publisher, it includes the editor, Karin Winter, it includes me, it includes a staff of editorial writers, it includes the cartoonist, it includes the Sunday Insight editor, and altogether there are about a dozen of us. But the editorial board, as at nearly every newspaper, is kept separate from the news coverage of the newspaper. There's a separation of church and state, so that those of us who deal in exercising our opinions and pressing our vision do not contaminate the coverage of the news, which needs to be as objective as possible. A few years ago, I was on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer with a panel of journalists, and they were asking us about how we reach these decisions on which presidential candidate to endorse. And I explained on the program that we kept our deliberations, the editorial board's deliberations, separate from those of the newsroom. And I said I would even suggest that most of the reporters and editors in our newsroom do not disagree with our endorsement of, at that time, it was probably George W. Bush in his first bid for election. The next day, as I passed through the newsroom to do something, not one but two people stopped to thank me for letting the world know that they did not agree with our endorsements. That's not what they do. They have a different point of view. So the way the editorial board functions on a day-to-day basis is we meet each day to discuss issues. The publisher meets with us on Mondays for a broad meeting of the entire editorial board, and the most contentious issues we take up in his presence. He can offer a view if he likes, he can be silent if he likes, but what we don't do is take a vote, nor do we behave like the Supreme Court, with one side issuing one ruling and one side issuing another. We have to come to a conclusion. We like to reach consensus where that's possible. We have an editorial board that certainly is not like-minded. In some cases, it wasn't even of like purposes in recent years. But we hash these things out. And people will often say, well, how did the vote go on this issue or that? We don't operate that way. And that's simply because all votes are not equal. The publisher's vote, if it goes one way and every other vote goes the other, it doesn't matter. The publisher's vote prevails. It's that way at every newspaper. The publisher, I hasten to add, does not get involved in the production of editorials on a daily basis, but he's there once a week, and he's there to make sure that we generally reflect what, again, and I think he would describe himself as a moderate Republican, that we stay in that corner of the pasture, more or less. And of course, we also meet, apart from our daily meetings each day, to sit down and discuss what issues we're going to editorialize on and what we're going to say. And after that process, I generally assign editorials and do a schedule, and editorial writers go off to their offices to write. But in addition to that, we meet 3 or 4 days a week with outside groups who want to come in to present their point of view. And I like to stress to people in San Diego that our door is always open to people in San Diego. Not necessarily to lobbyists in Sacramento or Washington, but always to people in San Diego. So let me just sort of wrap up by talking a little bit about how we try to operate. We like to view the editorial page and the op-ed pages as a marketplace of ideas. So on the editorial page, we present our own point of view. In unsigned editorials, we tend to publish columns that reflect our point of view on the editorial page. However, we have the op-ed page every day, and 3 days a week we have an additional op-ed page, 2 op-ed pages, where we publish letters to the editor and columns that run contrary to our point of view on a lot of things. So that if you read those pages, you really are going to get a broad spectrum of ideas, from a Paul Krugman to a George Will, if you know the liberal and conservative bent of those two of those two national columnists to our own columnists to letter writers in our community who write to express their views, often to disagree with editorials or news stories or other things they've seen in the newspaper. And frankly, we give preference to those letters. Let me conclude by saying that a newspaper, and its editorial board included, is a very organic thing. It is not a static name on a chunk of newsprint. It's a collection of human beings. And it changes as the group of individuals involved in producing it changes. It changes with the growth of a community. It's often said, and I'm going to cite just a couple of quick numbers here, that the Union-Tribune is more conservative than San Diego because San Diego has changed and is a different community than it used to be. Absolutely, San Diego is a different community than it used to be, demographically, politically, economically, and a lot of other ways. But the newspaper has changed with it, in my view. I'm going to offer you just a couple of numbers without putting you to sleep. But in the presidential election, in the November election, we took positions on the editorial page on 99 issues and candidates, 99 races, either propositions or candidates, which if you think about it, involves an enormous amount of work for us that began in August when we started interviewing candidates and people on both sides, groups on both sides of all of those ballot propositions. But if we look at how the voters of San Diego County voted on those 99 questions, they voted the way we urged them to do in 75 cases. They voted counter to that in 24 cases. That's a batting average of 76%. For our views reflecting, and I hope persuading and influencing the views of our readership. And I think a batting average of 760 is good in any league. However, the editorial page and the editorial board, we do not see our mission as to reflect necessarily what our readers want to hear from us or to sort of catch up with public opinion or get in front of public opinion. Frankly, we see our job as one of exerting leadership in the community, of perhaps influencing public opinion, persuading public opinion. And I'll close with what is my own private mission statement, but it's one that I preach to our editorial writers and that I think we all embrace, and that is our central purpose on the editorial page is to educate and to persuade, and in that order. I hope that with every editorial you learn something, you learn an idea or a thought. We don't necessarily expect to persuade our readers all of the time, but I do hope that with every editorial we do at least provide a little bit of education. So again, the Copley motto is the ring of truth. That's a very subjective standard, obviously. Some of you may feel that what we see as truth, you see very differently, but that is the nature of journalism. That's the nature of the marketplace of ideas. And with that, I see Herman has a stack of questions in his hand.
You don't need to look at your watch because I'll tell you it runs like this on the questions. We do it much like you do the letters to the editor. If you get more than 3 sentences, we're probably going to cut you here, okay? All right, biggest question that we get from everybody, and I got a couple of these. James Goldborough spent some time here telling us everything that goes on behind closed doors. Was there a particular reason why the editorial page of the UT chose to pull his last editorial? And I think it's fair to give you that rebuttal.
Sure. No, fair enough. Let me stress that Jim Goldsborough's columns appeared on the op-ed page. And they were on the op-ed page in part because they ran counter to the general view of the paper much of the time. But, you know, that's life. That's our job, to prevent all points of view. In this case, the column that prompted Jim Goldsborough to leave the paper was pulled from the paper by the publisher. He made the decision. I have not talked about his reasons with him directly, but it's my understanding that he felt the column was offensive to Jewish readers. And Jim had written a number of columns in the past that had offended, at the very least, Jewish leaders in San Diego who were constantly at our doorstep unhappy with his columns. So the publisher made that decision. What I can say is that's the publisher's right. I don't know of too many columnists who haven't at some point encountered a column that didn't pass muster. And it's unfortunate that Mr. Goldsboro decided to leave the paper, but that was his decision. He wasn't encouraged to leave, and in fact, the publisher encouraged him not to leave. But he chose to leave because of that, and that's his right, that's his prerogative.
Okay. Second question, and I'm going to read this one just as it's written. Liberals think your paper is conservative. Conservative thinks that you're too liberal. We've heard you use the term today, moderate Republican and others. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, that's fair enough, and it is absolutely true. Barely a day goes by that we don't get letters to the editor that criticize us for being too liberal or criticize us for being too conservative with the same editorial, the same position. That's the way people, that is liberalism, conservatism, those are very subjective terms. And so people can view the page however they like. I happen to think that we very closely reflect the body politic of San Diego. The majority of voters in San Diego County tend toward a moderate republicanism. George Bush won the election here. In fact, since 1948, 1944, San Diego County voted for FDR. In every presidential election since then, except one, San Diego County has voted for the Republican presidential candidate. The exception was Bill Clinton running against Bob Dole in 1992, when San Diego County voted for the Democratic presidential nomination. If you want me to describe our general philosophy, where we stand on the spectrum of politics, I simply say, look at San Diego. I think we're pretty much in sync with the politics of this community.
This question comes from Roy that says, why the change in position on the subject of the Strong Mayor Initiative? And I will add to that, did the potential election of Donna Fry change your position?
I can answer our change of position with two words: the publisher. I didn't quit over this issue. But let me say what the publisher's view was. I've been at the paper on the editorial page for 18 years. Long before I arrived at the paper, the editorial page was supporting the notion of a strong mayor, going back to the days when Pete Wilson tried to promote the idea. We have supported it all along. We urged the city council to put this matter on the ballot. As the election approached, the publisher told me that he supported the idea of a strong mayor. We discussed it in a number of meetings, but he thought the times were wrong. He was concerned with all of the chaos at City Hall. He was concerned about sort of the power plays going back and forth. And he said, I think we should say that we support the idea, as we always have, but that this is the wrong time for it, and therefore urge the voters to vote no. I gulped more than once. I discussed it a bit with him. In the end, it's his newspaper. So we said editorially, vote no, this is not the right time for it.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
That was very good.